So last week we were treated to not one but two new entries into the Star Wars universe. A Crash of Fate by Zoraida Cordova and Myths and Fables by George Mann or Mon? Not quite sure. But we're just going to be talking about A Crash of Fate as the title below suggests. Now, there will not be any spoilers other than general the setting and the premise of the book and things that happen extremely early on in the book, things that happen in like what is literally called the prologue, and stuff that you can understand by just reading the back of the book, reading the descriptor text. So there will be no spoilers in this video other than, like I said, super light, vague mentions of things in order to tell you how and why I enjoyed this book. First and foremost, that's very important, is that this is a romance novel in a lot of ways. It is as much a romance novel as Lost Stars by Claudia Gray was. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, I'm not big into romance. I don't really consume romance stories outside of Star Wars. It's just not my jam. It's just never really pulled me in, but I do appreciate a well-told one. When it's tied into something else that I enjoy, like a television show or a universe like Star Wars. And A Crash of Fate does an incredibly good job, in my opinion, of giving us a relatively unique perspective of two 18-year-old kids, really, Jules and Izzy, who were childhood friends, but for reasons that you find out about 2/3 of the way through the book, Izzy and her family leave Batuu in the middle of the night, and they don't see each other for 13 years. Then suddenly Izzy shows back up in the morning of a day, and the entirety of this novel takes place from that morning, basically, the beginning of that morning when Izzy shows up, all the way till the evening. And that's about it. The epilogue and the prologue are obviously a little bit separate, but not by much, really. And I really appreciate that from a shorter story like this. I wouldn't say that it's a short book. I was able to read it in about 4.5 hours or so. Keep in mind, I'm a relatively quick reader, and the audiobook itself is, I think, like 8.5 hours or something like that. And it is technically registered or classified as a young adult novel. However, in the words of Claudia Gray, one of the best authors in Star Wars, in my opinion, young adult doesn't necessarily mean it's just for young adults. It's not just for 18 to 22-year-olds. It is a story about young adults and about coming of age. And this is very much a coming of age story of two people who were very close as kids, and then they both show up again, and neither of them have very many friends. And it's, if you can put yourself back into being a 16, 17, 18-year-old, you can identify with both of these characters in a lot of ways. I think most people, especially in Western society, will be able to identify with both characters, given the fact that Izzy is pretty wounded by the time that she shows up on Batuu. And Jules is lonely. And those two types of characters play really well with each other, especially when you have a great author writing those characters. And in my opinion, Zoraida Cordova did a fantastic job. I'm actually looking forward to maybe picking up a couple of her other books just to read on the side, because in a lot of ways it felt like a Claudia Gray novel, to me at least. It felt like fun Star Warsy adventure with a little bit of teen romance thrown in. And while I've always said that I've never been a big person of the romance genre. I don't go out of my way to read romance. It's just not a genre that I'm super into. I do appreciate the melding of Star Wars with other stuff, whether that be a war movie, or whether that be a teen romance story, or whether that be a political thriller. Give me anything else that's not action, adventure, space, pew pews, and that space wizard pew pews of Star Wars, slam that together, and I always find that fun and interesting to see how they manage to make it still feel like Star Wars, as all the pundits call it, while still telling an interesting story from that specific genre. In this case, teen romance. Now, I do always try and nitpick and find one little tiny thing that bothered me about this book, or about any book really, any book or movie or anything, just so I'm not completely gushing about whatever it is that I generally enjoy. I enjoy most Star Wars. Some books and movies and stuff, maybe not so much, but I prefer to talk about things that I like. But if I could give you one nitpick of A Crash of Fate, the only thing that bothered me was, obviously it's set on Batuu. Obviously it is Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, A Crash of Fate is the entire title. Let me see here. On the dust jacket, it's like, there it is. See, Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, A Crash of Fate. And I get that the whole point of this is to do tie-ins and stuff like that. And I get that, with Orlando opening up soon, or Orlando just opening, and Anaheim Galaxy's Edge being up and running for a couple months now, and the Rise of the Resistance ride being a thing, you need to try and drive people towards that thing. That's part of the money-making business. But in a lot of ways, I kind of felt like I live in South Central Wisconsin, for those of you that don't know. And the only thing that really bothered me about any of the Galaxy's Edge stuff, like the comics and Crash of Fate and anything like that, is mainly just bitterness, Midwestern bitterness, because it's 1,500 miles to Orlando and 2,000 miles to LA. And while I'm very fortunate, I'm still solidly in the middle class, and I can only afford one big trip a year, really. And if there's a lot of clearly like, and here's cookies, and here's the cantina, and here's the Doc Ondar thing with all the collectibles, and I don't mean collectibles, I mean Den of Antiquities, which is definitely not where they expect you to spend $250 on a holocron or whatever. I don't know what the prices are, but it does feel sometimes where, okay, so by the way, you can see this in the park. I kind of felt like, especially reading the audiobook, listening to the audiobook. On the print version, it's a little bit okay. It's a little bit better for me. But in the audiobook, it kind of felt like they would mention like a name, like Smuggler's Alley or something like that. And it's like, I kind of wanted like a 1950s ad man to like pop out and be like, by the way, you can come to Galaxy's Edge in Anaheim, California like, that's what I was kind of expecting. And it kind of felt a little bit But again, that's just mainly Midwestern bitterness, because it would take me $5,000 to get there, have a hotel, actually be able to buy anything and come back. Plus take, a week off of work. But yeah, that's the only negative. This is a fantastic book. It adds quite a bit to the canon in a lot of ways. You learn that there are things happening on Batuu. There's nothing earth-shattering. Nothing like, and there's a Jedi temple hidden underneath Doc Ondar's. Nothing quite like that. But it ties into that emotional canon that I've talked about a couple of times, but stealing from Force Center, particularly Ken Knapsack. That it's not necessarily about trivia. Like, there's a mine on Batuu that does the thing, and there's Cortosis over there near Batuu, and Cortosis does the thing with the lightsabers. No, it's more about the emotional canon and kind of the political canon in a lot of ways. What is the First Order up to? What is the Resistance up to? What is the New Republic up to? This book takes place a couple of months after the destruction of the Hazi system, is what they call it. So I'm assuming it takes place a couple of months after both Episode 7 and Episode 8. Episode 8 maybe maxes out at a month after the destruction of the Hazian system. So by now, the Resistance has already fled Crate and is already starting to rebuild. And you can sense in the background that there are things happening somewhere else in the galaxy, and that the First Order is doing its thing and the Resistance is doing its thing, and it feels connected. That's a big thing for me, is I don't necessarily need like, okay, I need Princess Leia Organa to appear in, or General Leia Organa to appear in A Crash of Fate for it in order to tie in. It feels like two young people who have a crazy, weird adventure over the course of one day. I can see that crazy, weird adventure happening on some far-off planet in the middle of nowhere within a few months after the events of TFA and TLJ. And I really appreciate that kind of feeling. I don't know how they do it, but it feels right. In a lot of the Legends canon, mainly because the Legends canon wasn't quite as organized. There wasn't a story group to keep everything together. I'm assuming that's why. But in Legends canon, you never really got this feeling of... It always felt like they were connecting dots, right? For example, we'll just use these batteries here that I've got on my desk. Okay, here is the Thrawn trilogy. Okay? And they're talking about the defenses in Coruscant, the shields or whatever on Coruscant. It takes place 5 years after Return of the Jedi. Okay, now the X-Wing books come out by Michael A. Stackpole, the first ones, particularly Wedge's Gamble and the Krytos Trap, books 2 and 3 from the X-Wing books. And they draw a line. Okay, there's defenses on Coruscant that Thrawn needs to try and break through, right? And those same defenses get mentioned when Rogue Squadron and Wedge and Corran Horn and everything are trying to break through those defenses, which takes place 2 years before the Thrawn trilogy. So it's kind of like a line being drawn in between the two, right? With A Crash of Fate and with so much of the other Star Wars books, it feels more like this. You know, does that make sense? Where it's not a line, it's more of a web of stories. It feels, instead of like an interconnected random, like, okay, so this character shows up here and that character shows up there and this thing happens here and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. In the Legends continuity, with this new canon continuity, and this is all on the authors, this is all on the story group people, it feels like one amoeba, basically, or one multicellular organism is probably a better way of putting it. So I guess my point is that instead of a web of stories, you know, Thrawn trilogy here meets X-Wing trilogy here meets this thing over here, I'll say New Jedi Order over here meets Jedi Knight over here, you know, in this interconnected web of factoids that kind of connect to each other. It all feels like one multicellular organism, right? It all feels like they're working together to tell the same story, even though that they're coming out at different times and they are also scattered all over the timeline. It feels like everything was working together the way it should and in harmony. As opposed to like an artificial construct. Anyways, all of that rambling out of the way about how Lucasfilm and Disney is choosing to tell stories. Crash of Fate is a good book, in my opinion. It's a teen romance novel with a lot of Star Wars thrown in. And, you know, that's fun. That's fun to me to see. If you enjoyed Lost Stars, you're probably going to enjoy this. And what I mean by that isn't necessarily that they're the same. They do have different tones, and in my opinion, I actually maybe even like this. I like this better in different ways, or I like this in different ways than Lost Stars. Lost Stars is a very well told story, but there was a little bit too much Forrest Gumping going on, which I get. That's not on the author at all, Claudia Gray. But with this, it's a completely... I didn't feel the invasiveness of the original trilogy or the movies in general, not necessarily just the original trilogy. I didn't feel like, oh, well, they're in this time period, so they have to connect with, they have to run into Poe Dameron on Batuu. No, that doesn't happen, and that's a good thing in my opinion. And It feels more free-floating while still being part of that entire emotional canon of the new Star Wars canon. Anyways, enough of that. If you guys read or listened to this book, let me know in the comments down below. What did you think about it? Let's have a conversation down there. And look out for my Myths and Fables review that will be coming very, very shortly. Thank you guys as always, and as always, may the Force be with you. Take care.